Hello and welcome. My name is Amanda Popila and I'm a researcher in human capital at the Conference Board. It is my pleasure to be your moderator and host on today's webcast, Adapting to the Reimagined Workplace. I'm also joined today by two of my colleagues from the Conference Board who are also my co-authors on this research that we're going to be sharing today. It is a brand new piece of research and it's focused on how organizations are responding to COVID-19. So we're really excited to share some of the findings with you. You're actually one of the first groups to hear this brand new research. So before we get started, I'll just share a rundown of some of the questions that we're going to be answering today. We're looking at how remote working will become part of a company culture after the pandemic has ended. We'll look at how difficult or easy it is for organizations to find qualified workers right now compared to before the pandemic. We're going to talk about some of the main challenges in regards to mental health and well-being, as well as some of the workforce cost reduction strategies that organizations have employed during this time. And then we'll end with some of the transition plans to going back to an office or work environment, as well as the priorities for HR in terms of some of the concerns that people are facing in going back to an office. So before we get started on talking about all of that, we do have a jam-packed webcast today. Just some housekeeping items. If you are interested in earning HRCI, SHRM, or CPE credits, you can earn those credits if you're attending the broadcast live today. Please enter your name, email address, and the type of credit you need in the lower right-hand corner. We'll be sure to get those to you. And as a reminder, if you're looking for CPE credits, do click those the chat boxes that come up. You'll have to click OK 3 times. Also, we do have a chat box on the lower left-hand side of the screen, so please type your questions and comments throughout the webcast. I will be moderating and we'll answer your questions as we go along. So please don't hesitate to join in the conversation there. And with that, I'll introduce our panelists for today. As I mentioned, the presenters are co-authors on this report. We have 3 of us here today. Unfortunately, the 4th, Gad Lebanon, is on jury duty and was unable to join us today, but we do have 3 of us, 3 out of the 4. So Dr. Robin Erickson is principal researcher in human capital, and she's recognized as a thought leader in talent acquisition, employee engagement and experience, talent mobility, retention, as well as layoffs. So Robin, thanks for joining today. And we also have Frank Siemers, who is an economist with our Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center, and his expertise is primarily in the analysis of labor markets in the U.S. and other mature economies. So again, thank you both for joining today. We're excited to get started. And I will kick us off and just share a little bit about this report. So as I mentioned, this is research that hasn't even been published yet. It will be out within the next couple of days. And it's actually the sequel to a report that we published in May. And so you can see the link for that first report is on your screen. And you can download the deck as well and click that hyperlink. But this survey, the sequel, was fielded in late September. It will be released within the next couple of days. And we had 330 human capital executives respond to this survey. So we break the findings into 4 parts: remote work and hiring, productivity and well-being, the cost reduction actions, and then planning for a return to the workplace. So we're going to get into each of those topics on the webcast today, starting with the remote work and hiring. A little bit about who responded to the survey. You can see that the demographics here, they're a little bit small, but we did have a really good cross-section of industries. You can see about 1/3 came from business and professional services, but there's really a breakdown across industries and also across size of organization. So by headcount and revenue, we had a pretty good sample size. I want to draw attention to the first box, and I know it might be a little bit difficult to read, but we broke down some of the data by professional and office workers and industry and manual services workers. So we looked at organizations that employ primarily professional and office workers, and then separately those that employed industry and manual services workers. And we have the definitions here. We did that breakout because there are different ways that these organizations have responded and different actions that they're taking. So where there are differences, we'll highlight those as we go along, and just wanted to make sure that you can see how we define both of those groups before we get started. So with that, we will get started on our first topic of remote work and hiring post-COVID-19. And I think we're going to get started with a polling question. So if we could bring that question up. Question is, a year after COVID-19 has subsided, what % of your U.S. full-time employees do you expect will be working primarily virtually or remotely? And primarily, we mean at least 3 days a week. And this is a year after COVID. So whatever that means to you, if that's a vaccine is available, definitely, after we've passed all of the lockdowns and after the crisis itself has subsided. So what do you expect the long-term impacts of the pandemic to be in terms of remote and virtual work? And we've got response options here. I see the responses are coming in. We've got less than 10% of your workforce will be primarily remote, 10 to 20%, 20 to 40%, or 40% or more. Okay, and it looks like our responses, we have quite a few that have come in, so we'll give it a couple more seconds, and then we can stop the poll and show the responses. So really large numbers here. We're seeing quite a few that are saying 20 to 40%, and then a good amount are also saying 40% or more. So Robin, is this surprising to you? Is this what you expected? You're muted, Robin.
The 40% or more, we're going to share our survey results with you in a minute. It's almost exactly the same. Our results showed 34%. The number that's surprising to me here, though, is the 20% to less than 40%. That number is a lot higher than what we saw in our survey. And it could be that, we did our survey a month ago, and the world is changing, and it just could be that we don't know, and it's a different audience here too as well. But if you'd let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you our results. So remember Amanda said that we had actually done this survey back in April, and so these numbers are all increased in terms of the blue lines. One of the things we had said in April was that we thought that the remote work could become one of the lasting legacies of COVID-19, and we believe that to be true even now more than ever. So let me just explain to you what you're looking at here. The black line is before COVID-19. The blue line is the expectation 1 year after COVID-19 has ended. So that's the question we just asked you. So you can see that before COVID-19, less than 10% of our organizations reported, 74% of organizations reported that less than 10% of their employees were working remotely. Well, look at how, if you drop down now to the 40%, that number before COVID was 4%. So only 4% of the organizations said that only 4%. Sorry, this data is so confusing. But you can see here that 34% of the organizations said that 40% or more of their employees were working were working remotely. So then that number's changed to 34%, which is exactly what you had showed us at 33%. The interesting number, as I mentioned, was the blue line that's right above it, the 20 to less than 40%, where we had 28%. I think we just saw 45% or so. And so, obviously, the survey had a bunch of HR leaders. As Amanda said, we had 330 HR leaders responding. And it's always interesting to see how the same question is answered differently. But it'll be very, very interesting when we do the follow-up to this report. This is a sequel. I haven't figured out yet what you call a sequel to a sequel. If anybody knows, you can put that in the chat. But when we do the follow-up to this, it'll be very, very interesting to see if these numbers increase again. So with that, we did want to just show you, Amanda had also mentioned that we had looked at some of the data we divided up the data between those organizations that employ mostly professional and office workers and those that employ mostly industry and manual services. And obviously, those organizations that employ mostly industry and manual service workers have a harder time working remotely in many, many cases. It's much easier for the professional and office workers. And so you can see that the organizations that employ mostly professional office workers anticipate more full-time remote employees. And so all organizations were at 34%, saying that they thought 40% or more of their employees would be virtual or remote after the pandemic. But you can see, and so there's the April data. The April data is in black. The blue is the September data. But that is much, much higher, 46% for mostly professional and office compared to only 12% for mostly industry and manual services. So very little change from April with the industry and manual services, but there's a lot more organizations that now think that a large majority of their workers will be working remotely. So that we could, I'm going to turn over to Frank to talk to us about the differences in hiring that we're seeing.
Great, thank you, Robin. So let me go to the next slide. So of course, what you were just talking about, we're having this big shift in how companies are going to work and having their employees work more remotely. So one of these consequences, of course, is also what will this change in hiring? So this is one of the questions that we asked. So that is, how willing is your US operation to hire full-time employees who work predominantly virtually or remotely? So they could respond, we're not willing to hire them. We're willing to hire them only if they can occasionally commute into the office. We're fine having them anywhere in the US or even anywhere globally. So we asked this question, how this was in the organization before the pandemic, and then how it was in September, so last month. So I want to start with before the pandemic, so that's the lower bar here. So before the pandemic, actually 48, so almost half of the organizations that we surveyed were actually not willing to hire virtual workers. And then a very big share said that we're fine having some remote workers, but only if they can come into the office occasionally. Now you can now already see how big the changes are. So now almost 9 in 10 companies are fine having some form of remote working, so some form of hiring where people are not always going to be in the office. Still, I think many, 50% or 51% say we think it is important that they can occasionally come into the office. I think this is maybe in line with what we have been hearing from some of the members about some kind of hybrid model. You can work remotely, but we want to have the best of both worlds. So sometimes it's good to be in the office. But I think to point out also here, if you look at the light gray and the dark gray, that for some organizations, they're now fine having their employees anywhere. They've probably seen how well they're doing working remotely. And of course, this could mean a lot of changes to not just hiring, but also maybe to labor costs. If you can move to different geographies, in the case of going globally, if you can make it happen and you can overcome those hurdles from working in different time zones and other operational issues, that could mean a big change to companies and the economy overall. So if we go to the next slide, this is where we were looking first at all organizations. Now again, as Aman and Robin already were explaining, here we're breaking it up in mostly professional and office companies and companies with mostly industry and manual services workers. So again, you see that for mostly professional office companies, there you see that the increase to remote hiring is even more striking.
Thanks, Rick. And we did have a couple questions about the industries and the types of companies. So we do have the demographic slide that we showed earlier. If you download the presentation, you can see the breakout. But it really is a cross-section of industries, company size, and then you can see here the breakout between the professional and office organizations and those that employ mostly industry and manual services. So it's really a broad cross-section, which we know different industries and different types of companies will respond in different ways. But this just kind of gives a general overall picture. And I also just want to mention, Robin, if you haven't seen the chat yet, we do have a response to what a sequel of a sequel is. So it's a threequel.
Hey, I did see it and I smiled. I don't know if anybody saw me smiling privately over here to myself, but thank you so much. It's a threequel, so hey, there we go. Now we know.
All right, thank you, and I think we can keep going now.
Okay, so let me go. So we've now talked about remote working, what is going to mean for remote hiring. We were also just interested to find out how is hiring in general going. So we asked companies, how difficult is it currently for your organization to find qualified workers? Like in the previous question, we asked them, how was it just before the pandemic, so January, February, and how was it in September? Again, we asked it for companies with mostly professional office workers, that are the left two bars here, and the mostly industry and manual services, that are the right two bars here. So I want to start on the left side. You see that before the pandemic, most companies were saying that they had difficulties hiring, and that is also research that we were often writing about and presenting about, because we saw that that were labor shortages and a lot of companies had difficulties hiring. Now, of course, in March, April, we know we had huge employment losses and an unemployment rate that went over 10%. So in normal times, that means that you all of a sudden have so many people looking for jobs that then generally it becomes a little easier for companies to find qualified workers. So in the case of professional office companies, this is in some way happening, but I think that the difference is not too big yet. But maybe let's focus mostly on the industry and manual services companies here. There actually we haven't seen a change, and maybe if you look at those organizations that said it is now very difficult, so that are dark gray bars here, there's almost a doubling. And I think that is also pointing out that even though we have a very high unemployment rate at the moment, I think it is interesting and important to realize that many of people who are now currently unemployed are not as actively looking for work as they might have been doing in other periods, so in history. So what we're seeing is that many people are still furloughed, so they expect to be recalled to their current job, and as a result, they may not be looking actually for a new job. So that means that if companies are still looking for workers, even though the unemployment rate is high, it may actually still be pretty difficult to find workers. And let me say one more thing about the difference between professional office and industry manual services. We know, of course, you can work remotely in professional office companies and much less so in industry manual services. And we know there's still some fear out there to maybe go to work site. If you have to take care of some dependents, you may not be willing to leave the home. So that can be reasons why we see this difference between these two types of companies. So with that, Amanda, or shall I give it over to you, Robin, for the next slide?
So I'm taking over for the next slide, so thank you, Frank. And the next slide will probably be interesting to you, given that organizations are still having a hard time finding qualified workers. We were a little bit surprised to find out that there was only a slight change in willingness to hire non-traditional workers since before the pandemic outbreak. And so we asked a question in the survey saying, you know, compared to before the pandemic, how has your organization's willingness to hire non-traditional workers changed? And so, you know, 2% said they were significantly more willing, 14% said that they were somewhat more willing. And so while it really isn't a very high number, 16%, we do think that it could reflect a little bit of a change in the trend around employer willingness to hire non-traditional workers. And we actually published a report a couple years ago called Contrary to the Hype, The Real Trends in Non-Traditional Work. And so if you're interested in that, you can pull that down. But we'll be very interested to see if this number changes at all, and because we'll be able to compare to this survey with our threequel. So thank you again for giving us that info. So a lot of information that we've just shared with you on remote work and hiring, and some really good news, and from the perspective of employers being more willing to hire remote workers. But there is a little bit more to the story, and we're going to go into that right now. We're going to talk about productivity and well-being. And the first slide that we wanted to share with you is comparing the April to the September data. And so The Conference Board was one of the first organizations to do a survey back in April. Remember, COVID sounds like a long time ago, but COVID really started here in the U.S. the end of February, beginning of March. I was actually in New York on March 6th, the day the mayor declared a state of emergency. So Conference Board is headquartered there. I live in Chicago, so I'll never forget that date, I don't think. But so if you look at the bottom bar there, you can see that the dark blue is, so the question was, how has the productivity of your U.S. employees changed? And obviously, this is self-reported data. But you can see in April, 4% said it had decreased substantially, 32% said it had decreased moderately, 42% said it hadn't changed, and only about 23% had said that it had increased either moderately or substantially. So if we look now at the September data, no one said that it decreased substantially. And the numbers around increased moderately or increased substantially are pretty high. The increased substantially is still the same at 8%, but increased moderately more than doubled, almost tripled, went from 15% to 39% increased moderately. So the good news is that with the addition of more people are working remotely, and more people are expected to be working remotely, that productivity really isn't seeing the hit that perhaps was expected back in April. And obviously, the pandemic was new at that point. The layoffs had just started, our high unemployment in this country leading to an economic crisis. And so, perhaps people have gotten more used to it. They're seeing that it's working. And so, productivity increasing at almost 50% is pretty exciting for organizations to be reporting that. But we also then wanted to look at the well-being of employees. And so I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to do a poll for us to get your thoughts on what's happening during this pandemic. And then we'll share with you the results of our data. So Amanda, if you'd pull up the next poll.
Yep. Yes, if we can get that next poll. And while we're transitioning, we are getting a few questions on remote work. And this whole presentation, a lot of it has to do with working remotely. But we also do, as the Conference Board, have other resources that are specific about what kind of best practices or what companies are doing, some case studies on what companies are doing as they transition to remote work. So thank you for those questions. But so this polling question, responses are already coming in, but since the outbreak, on average, which of the following have increased? And you might need to read carefully because some of them are more positive things than others. But are your employees on average spending more time in meetings? Are they working more hours? Are there more burnouts, more mental health problems? Is there increased work-life balance? Is there increased employee engagement? And are there more employees with high personal well-being? So as I said, the responses have been coming in. We're getting quite a few, and you can select all that apply.
And Amanda, I'll just give a little bit of a preview. Amanda's actually working on a report around remote work. So when COVID happened here in the Human Capital Center, we pivoted very quickly, and we've produced about 20 reports on different areas within HR. So if you're interested, we do have those. They're all on our hub, the COVID-19 hub. But we are actually pulling the information about remote work that's in each of those and putting it into a report. And so at some point, hopefully in the relatively near future, we'll have a new report on remote work for those of you, because it's clearly a topic of great interest. So.
Yeah. Yep. So I think we can close the poll. And thank you, Robin, for highlighting that report. It will be out soon. So we can see more time in meetings and more work hours are a clear majority. Work-life balance has improved for quite a few as well. So, Robin, I think this matches fairly well with what we've seen, but do you want to go into our findings?
Sure, yeah, let's go into the next slide. And our results, so the blue bars show the increase and the black the decrease. And so I'll just go through these line by line. So we said, since the outbreak of the pandemic, on average, how have the following areas shifted for your employees? You can see that 63% of the organizations reported that their employees are spending more time in meetings. 60% of the organizations who responded said that their employees are working more hours. 42% of the organizations that responded said that their number of employee burnouts has increased. That's, I think, a little bit higher than we just saw in this survey here with the results with you. But 40% also said, probably very close to the burnout one, very correlated, the number of employees with mental health problems, 40% of the organizations that responded said that that had increased in their organizations. I'm very interested to see the work-life balance, the increase that we just saw reported. Gallup actually has published that, or employee engagement rather. Gallup, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's very split on work-life balance, as you can see. 29% said it's better in our survey. 46% said it's worse. In terms of employee engagement morale, we had 31% say it was. 31% of the organizations that responded said it was worse, and only 22% said it had improved. Maybe some of you have seen the research that just came out from Gallup that says that employee engagement is at an all-time high in the United States. And isn't that fabulous? We're all doing our jobs so perfectly, but they only report that employee engagement with their questions is only at 40%. So I really hope that your employee engagement surveys are showing employee engagement at higher than that. But we're finding in the surveys that we've been doing that there's a real split. Some organizations are reporting that employee engagement and morale has gone down. Some are reporting that it's gone up. In fact, one survey that I did, it had 50% of the respondents say it had gone down, and 50% of the respondents say it had gone up, and nobody said it had stayed the same. So we're definitely going to be doing some more research on that topic and to look into sort of what's happening. Are employees happy to be home because they don't want to be in the office with COVID, or are they happy to be home to have the opportunity to work remotely? So we'll do some more research and try to figure that out. But I did just want to note too that the last line, the number of employees with high personal well-being, 35% of the organizations responded said that that had decreased, while only 12% said that that had increased. So what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is that organizations are reporting that productivity is not decreasing. More organizations are reporting that productivity is actually somewhat increasing, but it's coming at a cost, and it's coming at a cost to well-being. And those 60%, the fact that 60% of the organizations said that their employees are working longer hours is incredibly significant. In case you're interested, we actually did a regression analysis to find out if remote work was having an impact on any of these data points here. And it's not remote work. We really feel like it's not all remote work. We found out it's very little bit to do with remote work. So it's coming down to the fact that there's a health crisis for our friends and our families and for ourselves. We're going to tell you more toward the end of the document, what employees are most concerned about with returning to the workplace. There's a financial crisis. Even if people are employed, oftentimes their friends or families are not, they're unemployed or underemployed. And we also have a lot going on in this country in terms of, we also have this summer, a lot of racial protests, and obviously we have the election coming up. And so I think there's just an awful lot going on right now, and it'll be very, very interesting in time to try to figure out how these numbers change if some of these things can be improved. And again, I'll be very interested in our threequel to see how this data might change. So with that, oh yeah, do you guys want to, please chime in or give us any questions.
Yes, so I think you, just let me chime in for a little bit. I think you explained it very well, Roman. I think what we see all these changes, big increase in productivity, but also big increase in hours worked, and then also these increases in, say, employee burnout. What makes it so difficult is, one, we have an economic crisis, two, we have a pandemic, and then three, we have this big shift all of a sudden to remote work. So what is causing what? So that is, I think, the big challenge for HR leaders. what is, like the economic crisis, that is something you cannot control. The pandemic is something you cannot control. Remote working is something that you can maybe have some influence on. At least from our, you said the regressions, we don't see that remote work is increasing productivity, neither decreasing productivity. I think that's already a big insight, but we also didn't see that companies that shift to remote work, that only they have more hours. Also companies that didn't shift to remote work are also working longer hours. So I think over the coming year, over the coming months, I think it will be especially important for HR leaders to at least find out, is remote working causing my employees maybe to work longer? Because we think that that might be the big driver of all these changes to well-being.
And let me just add on to that.
Yeah, and I think,
just let me add on to what Frank said, and then we'll have you chime in. I believe that we need to make sure, I think managers need to make sure that they're talking to their employees about the number of hours being worked. Part of our crisis right now with COVID is that we're not supposed to go anywhere. And so if you're not supposed to go anywhere and we have the technology to work 24/7, it makes it really, really easy for people to just not shut off and not take care of their own well-being. So what were you going to say, Amanda?
Well, I think all of that is true, and that's what we're seeing in the chat box as well. A lot of comments about there are so many different things going on right now, and the burnout, yes, we're seeing it on this chart that there are longer hours being worked, we're spending more time in meetings, we're working harder, we might have had layoffs or furloughs, so less people doing more work, and just managing through a crisis, in itself creates more work. But then there also is that life side too. So we've got children at home, we're dealing with the personal consequences of COVID-19 as well. So all of that is part of this, and I think there's a little bit of a discussion in the chat box on these different various pieces that might be at play here. But I think from what we've seen, it's all of it together. It's not just either or.
One of the words that keeps getting bounced around is unprecedented. We see huge responses to crises, right? Great responses for the most part. When 9/11 happened, there was an immediate outpouring. When we had the Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, huge outpouring of help, and I call it crisis goodwill. And you can have crisis goodwill at the organizational level, where organizations, they're not saying, "Are you getting your job done?" They're saying, "Are you okay? What can we do? How can we help?" Making sure you're safe, and your colleagues too, right? When someone has a crisis in their family, or a house burns down, or a family trauma, or medical emergency, colleagues will almost always step up and say, "How can I help? What can I do?" and to fill in. And so you've got this crisis goodwill on the organizational side and also on the colleague side. Well, whoever thought that this crisis would last for 8 months and would spawn so many other crises? So I think that's also part of what's going on here. It's just we're getting tired.
Yeah.
Anything else come in,
Absolutely.
Amanda, in the chat?
No, but keep up the comments in the chat. I think as much as we can share with each other what we're experiencing
All right,
is
well,
helpful for everyone as well.
You
So,
tell us about what we found out about dependent care.
Yes. So this next slide, we're looking at organizations' offerings for child care and dependent care. So the blue bar is child care, and then the black one is the dependent care. And we're seeing that mostly organizations are offering greater flexibility. So that top line, most organizations are offering flexibility in work hours. Quite a few are offering unpaid time off or other leave options to provide greater flexibility for those who have care needs at home. And we're seeing much less of some of the other benefit offerings. So very few organizations that are offering tutoring or coaching services or providing stipends or even child care on site. So those options, I think we're still working through what kind of offerings are out there and what a company can realistically offer, and trying to help our employees as much as possible, because we know that this is a great issue that many employees are facing right now, and employers are feeling the need to do something, to help out, but we're still figuring out how to do that. So, so that was our finding here. And and that was the last one in this section. We're going to move on to workforce cost reduction actions. And I think we're going to start this off with a poll as well. So if we could bring that up. Okay, so this third poll, we're asking, how is your organization responding to COVID-19 in terms of what cost reduction actions it's taking? So these are all related to employees and what you're doing to reduce costs in your workforce. And you can see there is an other option. So if you're doing other things, please add them to the chat box. So we do see, some organizations are increasing their hiring right now. Some are reducing hiring, kind of depending on where you're at and the economic realities of the organization. But we also have reducing hours, cutting bonuses, cutting salaries and wages, implementing furloughs, conducting layoffs. And then there are other actions. And we've heard from other organizations things like reducing 401k benefits or tuition reimbursement, other benefits that might be cut. Or anything else that you might be doing to reduce some of those costs right now.
And a lot of people actually are doing what we asked. I think this is a great thing. When we say other, please specify in the chat box. People are filling that in. So just so you know, Amanda, I think we're getting a lot of good insight actually in the chat box. But be interesting to see how these results compare to our survey results.
Yeah. Yeah, it will be, and I am seeing some of those in the chat box. There are a lot coming in, so that's great. Reducing some of the benefits, and actually in enhancements too. So we don't have that as much in our question, but looking at enhancing some of the benefits, I think that's important to call out as well. So I think we can close the poll, and we are seeing quite a few saying they're reducing hiring, and we do know there are a lot of hiring freezes or restricting hiring to critical roles. That's a common one. Quite a few that are saying they're conducting layoffs right now. Let's see some of the other options, implementing furloughs.
Yeah, with furloughs, that's relatively high as well. That's a quarter of our participants.
Yeah. Yeah, so quite a few of these actions that are happening. So Frank, do you want to walk us through this?
So let me first comment on what we just saw on the poll question, because it's similar to what we actually see in our responses. Let me just go to the slide where you can see it. At the top, restrict hiring to critical roles. So this is aligned with the reduce hiring from the poll question. It's an action that is relatively easy for companies to do, and the first thing that often companies were also doing is if you cannot grow as much anymore, or you need to be careful with how many costs are going out of your company, you slow down on hiring. So that is what we were seeing. In our list, or in our question, we asked it slightly differently. So we asked, what are you currently doing? But we also asked, are you taking this action, or did you already take this action, or are you expected to take this action within the next 3 months? So that you get a more of a forward-looking perspective. So that are the dark gray bars that you see here. I think interestingly in our list, increase hiring. Now 26% of companies already did that. 12% is expecting to do so in the next 3 months. I think that's a very positive development. If we looked in April, very few companies were thinking about that, but we know that we're now in the recovery phase, so you see that more companies are now thinking about increasing hiring. We saw in the poll question also relatively equal conduct permanent layoffs and furloughs. Again, in April, most companies were just furloughing their people, but we now are so many months into this crisis, they need to make these decisions, and we were also expecting to later in the year see that more companies were conducting these permanent layoffs, and that is also what we're seeing now. 29% already did it, at least for our organizations that we surveyed, and 9% is still expecting to do so in the next 3 months. So I think that this is also showing that a lot of the pain for some employees is actually still to come. We're still not out of this crisis. If you look, for example, down to implement a major restructuring of the organization, almost 2 out of 5 companies, or 1 in 5 companies already did that, and still 13% is actually expecting to do so in the next 3 months. So that are really the big changes to some of the organizations, and that could again mean that some people may be laid off, or maybe some contracts people leaving will not be replaced anymore. So I think that are the most interesting insights. Maybe, as you also said in the poll question, very few companies are actually willing to cut salaries and wages. We also have it down on the list, and only 2% is expecting to do so in the next 3 months. And I think, Robin, if we look at reversals, what you are going to talk about, it's also something that is standing out.
Yeah, so since we did this survey and asked this exact same question back in April, we wanted to see if any of the organizations that had already taken these actions had actually reversed them. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see that there have been some reversals, perhaps not as many. Whoops, sorry, two of us doing it at the same time. So any of those respondents who said that they had already taken an item got an extra question, and we asked them, have you reversed, if you've already taken this action, have you, by September, had you actually fully or partially reversed that finding, or not that finding, that cost reduction action? And as Frank had said, you know, at the beginning of a crisis, organizations don't know what's going to happen, and they don't know if they're going to be able to do business as usual, and so they do take cost reduction actions, and most of the time they're pointed toward their people. And so we were actually pretty pleased with the fact that some of these had been reversed fully and even more partially. And so we'll just run through this. You can see implement furlough with benefits. The dark blue is that the action was fully reversed, so that had happened with 16% of the organizations. 42% said that they had partially reversed, which means that they're bringing people back. If the implementing furloughs without benefits, 13% had been able to fully reverse that, 44% partially reversed. Reducing hours worked, 13% had been able to fully reverse that, and 42% had been able to partially reverse that. The one that stuck out the most to us, though, was this one here about cutting salaries and wages. 53% said they hadn't reversed it, so that's over half, but 25%, quarter of the organizations that had implemented cutting salaries, they actually had fully reversed this by September, which we think is a really, really positive outcome of the fact that organizations are perhaps more confident that they're going to make it through this crisis. And then the only other one I wanted to just point out was around deferring pay increases or bonuses. 14% actually were able to walk back and to fully reverse that. 18% had partially reversed that. So, and obviously, again, in our 3-quill, our hope would be that those blue lines would be much longer, and that the dark gray lines would be much shorter. Frank or Amanda, anything you want to add to this, or any questions come in?
So
Yes, the only thing that I'd like to add.
yeah, so the only
ahead,
thing what I want to add is at the top of the list we have furloughs, and you see that still a large share of companies did not reverse them at all, but that can also just mean they are turning into permanent layoffs. In the beginning of this crisis, companies had maybe expected that some, maybe all workers could be recalled, but as this crisis was taking longer and longer, companies have been needing to adapt to this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I just wanted to add, we saw a couple comments in the chat box about real estate or office presence. And that was not something that we asked in our question, but we've gotten this question a few other times. In other surveys, we do ask about the real estate presence. And we're finding that a lot of organizations are rethinking, and whether that means they're going to cut down in cities and city centers, or or just move locations. We are seeing that that's going to be a topic, and maybe something else that we can explore in our
Well, here's the other thing. We didn't leave it out. We didn't think it wasn't important. Our labor market team that Frank is part of and Gad Lebanon have been writing about the impact on city centers of this pandemic, but we didn't think it was related to human capital, and this was human capital lead to responding. to the survey, but we will, as Amanda said, add it to our 3QL and just hope nobody notices that probably technically real estate may not fit there as well. But I think, Amanda, you said you had seen one survey where 75% of the organizations were rethinking their real estate, which is just a huge number.
Rethinking. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it makes sense. It is a huge number, but it makes sense to at least be thinking about it. Do we really need as much office space as we have? There was a question on what we mean by reversed, and so I just want to go through those real quick. So the fully reversed means that it goes back to pre-pandemic levels. So for instance, if employees were furloughed, then they would be brought back in. So fully reversed means that everyone is brought back in. Partially reversed means that some may be brought back and some are still furloughed. So that's kind of the distinction that we made there. And as Robin mentioned, we see that the cut salaries and wages, that was kind of the first thing, it seems like, that people are bringing back fully with 25%. And the next comment, I was just, we just very recently are seeing new signs of recessions in U.S. and Europe, more restrictions coming into place this upcoming week. So I think that is a good call out, and obviously the survey was end of September, so it was before some of that happened, although we had been thinking with the fall coming that more restrictions might be put in place. So it would be interesting to see how this will now change going forward through the fall, knowing that some of the restrictions are now coming back. So I do think that's
and guys, hey, just so you know, survey research is really hard. And it usually takes much longer than 4 or 5 weeks, and so we realized that the survey was done at the end of September and that a lot may have changed between then and now and will probably change in the next month, but we're really actually proud of ourselves for being able to do a survey at the end of September and get it out at the end of October, very beginning of November. So with that, I'm going to turn it over.
Things are moving quick, yeah. Things are moving quick.
They're moving quick, and we're trying to move quick as well. So, and actually, we'll mention that in this next section a little bit. We did a couple short rapid response surveys earlier this fall, and we may mention some of those and make, you can obviously find those. They're all available, the results. But I'm going to turn it over to Frank to talk to us about returning to the workplace.
Yeah, I think that is our next big section where we ask companies, so how are they thinking about returning to the workplace? When are you expecting to do so? How are you expecting to do so? What are your biggest fears? Before doing so, we also were just interested to first see how are companies actually doing in terms of revenue? How far below pre-COVID-19 levels are they still? When are they expecting to go back to normal? Because this is, of course, an important indicator. If you're doing well, there may be less pressure to go back to the office. If you're noticing we're actually not doing too well, you may have a need to go back to the office as fast as you can. Overall, though, we have been seeing that working from home is, for most companies, working out. So let me go to the chart here. So we just asked, when do you expect your US-based revenue level to return to pre-COVID-19 levels? On the left side, you see 26% already returned or was never really impacted. And then you see 4% that expects to go back over the next 3 months. But most organizations either expect that it happens at the start of 2021, but I would say the majority it says it will take at least until April 2021. And I think it is interesting, again, if we compare this to our responses from April. At that time, I think there was still a lot of uncertainty. Companies were maybe more positive about the time frame, and they expected to go back to normal faster. And now we see that more companies know, okay, this is going to take a much longer time. And in some cases, it might still take more than a year before you're back to normal. And I think that if we look to the overall economy, these responses, I would say, are also more in line. We know we had this big drop in March and April. Since then, we have been recovering. Today, we had new GDP numbers for the third quarter, a very big recovery, but still we're very well below February levels, and it will take time before we get for the overall economy back to normal. We are projecting, we have a lot of different scenarios, but probably sometime in 2021, maybe in the middle of 2021. But of course not for all companies. Some companies and some industries will be doing better than others. And I think most important to thinking about is when is the economy going back to normal, when is my company going back to normal. That is the virus, and maybe a good vaccine that can be distributed. That will be the most important indicator, and I think also for companies when they can return to the workplace. So with that, let me give it then to you, Amanda, I think, for the next question we asked about returning to the workplace.
Yep. Yeah. The next couple slides, we're going to look at when companies plan to plan to go back. And so this one, we really see that most companies by March of 2021 do have plans to return. So we see about 1 in 5 are already back to a work site or an office. Some of them never left. So that's about what we would expect, that some kind of always stayed, some went back in September. But the great majority have a date set somewhere before March 2021. Of course, that could very well change. Just because we have a date set doesn't mean it's not going to change. And we've already seen it change a few times. And then the remainder, not too many have a date set later than April of next year. If you don't have a date for the beginning of the year, it's likely that there's something else going on. So either it's unknown, they're waiting for a vaccine. The other category is pretty high, you can see. So some of the responses that we had there were, it depends on the trends, it depends on what happens this fall, it's the geographic location, it might vary by group of worker or by location. So lots of different things going on, as we all know, and a lot of uncertainty about when we're going to respond, and also how we're going to respond. So the next slide, we're actually going to show how employees will be expected to return. And so that's either voluntary or mandatory or a little bit of both. And we can see the majority are saying that it's going to be voluntary for some or voluntary for all. So only 11% are saying that returning is going to be required for all employees. And most are saying that it's going to be voluntary. It's still a good amount saying that it's unknown. So with both of these results, we can see there's just a lot going on here, and a lot that's still kind of up in the air with how the fall goes and how things continue in the next few months, which adding uncertainty to employees can be challenging as well. So we did see a lot of comments that they set a date, or they're trying to give some certainty, or some, this is the earliest date we'd have to go back, so you at least can plan through the next few months. But providing some kind of certainty in the midst of all of this, I think, has been helpful, and something that we're seeing organizations try to do. So I don't know if Robin or Frank, you have any other comments?
I just want to add the comment about the uncertainty and give you a little bit of other data. Just recently co-wrote a report on resilience and how important it is, and we found out that in September of 2019, the Center for Disease Control said that 8% of Americans had a diagnosed case of anxiety. That's based on the medical codes, and again, that's diagnosis cases of anxiety. And if we had time, I'd do another poll question and see what you think that is now. But it's actually gone up to 25% a year later in September of 2020. So that's diagnosed cases of anxiety. Think of all the people who haven't been diagnosed. And at the time when we wrote that report, only 1.5% of Americans had actually caught COVID. So the number of people who are concerned about it, have a diagnosed case, is 17 times higher. And so anything you can do in your organization to help lower that level of anxiety with your employees, we highly recommend. And we're about to talk about the next one, which is how you can find out. And so, Amanda, if you wouldn't mind going to the next polling question, the last one, we will do that.
Yes. And I know we're running low on time, so let's go through this polling question and make sure we get to the last few questions here. So this is for you personally. This is actually, we asked this in the survey as well, not focus on the company, but on the person, the individual. How comfortable are you with returning? And the options are very comfortable and want to return, moderately comfortable, not comfortable with returning to a work environment right now. And then, of course, there's the it depends, which is been a common response today, but if you have a it depends answer, if you could put what it depends on in the chat box.
Yeah, so I just go ahead and broadcast the results, so I think we'll be able to show folks what we found.
Yep. So a lot in the moderately comfortable range, and pretty split between very comfortable and not comfortable. So kind of a split result here. So Robin, if you want to go into
so we found
what we
almost
found.
exactly the same number, 29% of HR leaders. Remember, that was the survey. Those were the respondents for this survey. We had 330 HR leaders, and 29% that they were very comfortable and want to return. Remember, a few minutes ago I mentioned we did some earlier surveys this summer, and we asked we had 1,100 employees respond to a survey with this exact same question, and 17% said that they were very comfortable, want to return. So that's a 12% difference. So we also asked whether or not people were feeling pressured to return to keep their jobs, and that number is much, much higher at the lower levels of the organization. And so, you know, while it could seem like really good news, you know, again, these are leaders. Remember, they know more about what's happening with the organization. They may have direct reports they're worried that aren't being as productive, and they know more about what plans the organization has for protecting employees. So we highly, highly, highly recommend that you are talking to your employees. We did another survey right at the end of August. We had over 1,100 executives respond saying that only 59% had actually surveyed their organizations, their employees, to find out their comfort level in returning to the workplace. So I'll give a shout out. We just finished a series on continuous listening, which you can find on our website. But that's something that you might want to think about. If you haven't already pulsed your employees, it's time to do that. So we'll go to the next slide. And we asked everyone what their biggest concerns were. Again, this page would take us too long to go through, but still you can download this report and see what people are most concerned about. But the majority are most concerned about COVID-19 exposure for themselves or for their family, and then the lack of an available and effective vaccine. So, Amanda, why don't we go through a few more questions? We can stay a couple minutes late if needed, but what else has come in?
Yeah, I think actually we have quite a few questions that I know we're not going to have time to get to today, but I will say a lot of them are answered in some of our short reports. And so Robin mentioned that we have these 20 reports focused on COVID-19 and looking at things like productivity and communication and well-being and anxiety. All of these questions that are coming in, you know, hopefully you'll find an answer in those reports, and feel free to reach out to us at any time, and we're happy to share where you might find some information there. So I do, in the last remaining moments, just want to share here's a summary of everything that we talked about today, so you have it all in one place, all the major findings from this report. And want to remind you all that there is an evaluation coming up on your screen, so please do take it should take less than a minute to provide your feedback, and also that this webcast will be available on demand. You do have access to download the presentation at the bottom of the screen. And please join us on November 18th at 2 p.m. for our next labor market update, so you can register at the link here. And also our next Human Capital Watch is on November 18th, the same day. So you can see our speakers here and register for that as well. And finally, the link that I was talking about earlier, this is our COVID hub, so you'll find all of our short reports, all of the information from all of our centers that we post on COVID-19 can be found here. So please do check out that link and let us know if you have other questions about that as well. And then we have a couple slides with podcasts as well, so we've got a lot of information available. So our Human Capital team has a podcast channel, as well as our Economic Strategy and Finance Center. So again, thank you all for joining today. Thank you to Frank and Robin for the great discussion. I'm Amanda Popila with the Conference Board, and we thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.